All right, this is lecture number 3 of our childbirth education series on labor. Now we started off, the first 2 lectures started off with induction and state of mind. And I did that because there are things in those lectures that you need to know even really at the beginning of your pregnancy, very far along, very early on. But now we're going to actually get into the meat of it, which is normal labor and how normal labor proceeds. And it's important to know what is normal labor and what it looks like, because if you don't know what normal labor looks like, you might think there's an emergency when there really isn't. So, first of all, during a normal labor scenario, your baby is going to undergo what are called the cardinal movements of labor. And those are engagement, descent, flexion, internal rotation, extension, external rotation, and expulsion. And please refer to the handout on those to get a more detailed explanation of them. But basically what the cardinal movements of labor do is they help your baby make the descent from the uterus down through the birth canal and come out. It's not just a straightforward sort of a thing where you're just pushing and the baby comes out. The baby has to turn to make its way through just out the birth canal. The baby has to turn and make all these different movements to fit. What's the old joke that you're pushing a watermelon through a straw? Well, the watermelon fits through the straw because the straw dilates and because the watermelon is able to adapt to the straw. That first stage labor. So the first stage of labor goes from the onset of regular contractions until the cervix is fully dilated to 10 centimeters, and the mother begins pushing. Now, the first stage of labor is divided into 3 phases. We have early labor, active labor, and transition. And so first we're going to talk about early labor. So early labor, this is the beginning of labor. It can start dramatically with your water breaking like you see in TV and the movies, or it can start with the loss of your mucus plug and you're seeing bloody show. And it can be more subtle, like these contractions that have been going off and on for a few days and they start to become more and more regular. So it may also start with like an odd backache that gets stronger and then subsides with repeated regularity. And some women are even walking around at like a 4 or 5 dilated 4 or 5 centimeters for even a few days before the actual onset of labor. So, I mean, if you go into like your OBGYN and they're like, oh, you're dilated to 4 or 5 centimeters and it's going to be any day now, it could still be a few days. Every birth is different. So there are some general guidelines, but every birth is just going to be different. So you'll know that the contractions are becoming regular because they'll get closer together and they won't ease up by changing positions, eating, sleeping, lying down, things like that. Or exercising is another thing that can make the contractions let up if they're not true labor contractions. So the late Dr. Bradley characterized each phase of the first stage of labor with an emotional signpost. That's what he called them, that there's an emotion that kind of governs that stage. And he said the emotional signpost of early labor is excitement. Mothers will often have a burst of energy. They'll cook a meal or a birthday cake. They'll reorganize the linen closet, because they're just feeling so energized. When I was in labor with my first son, I decided to wash all of my cloth diapers right there and then in early labor. My labor progressed faster than my washing did, though. Cloth diapers weren't ready when he arrived. Moms will generally feel happy and excited during this phase, and you should eat and drink if you feel like it. Don't eat a big heavy meal, but definitely get some water, have a drink, have a light meal, because when labor progresses, you are going to want to have the hydration and the nutrition in you to deal with the physical exertion of that, but you're not going to want a heavy meal because your stomach could start to turn. I think of it like a sporting event. If you're going to go run a marathon or compete in a soccer game, you don't want to eat a big, huge meal beforehand. So just keep it light. And if this stage happens at night, if you find yourself going into early labor at night, it's it can be a good time for both parents to just get some sleep and relax if you're feeling up to it. In the daytime, you might consider going and taking a walk, and just kind of don't overexert yourself, but be active. Kind of take your cues from your body. Now, let's take a moment here. We have a special note on Hollywood labors. We've seen these in the movies and TV. Suddenly the woman's water breaks dramatically and she's rushing to the hospital. If your water breaks, it's a good idea to wait, to call the midwife or go to the hospital birthing center until the contractions have become more regular, because it may not proceed as quickly as people sometimes think it does. You can have your water break and still be a few hours or even a couple of days out from labor. So don't assume that if your water breaks that you are automatically headed into labor and you need to leave right now, because if that happens, if you rush off to the hospital and you're not fully in labor yet, it's going to be a long road and you might be induced and just it can make things a lot more difficult than they need to be. If your water does break at any point in your labor, but especially if you have one of those dramatic water breaking at kickoffs, do not put anything in your vagina. No tampons, don't have sex, don't have baths. Those things will all introduce bacteria into the vagina and they can cause a serious infection. So once the bag of water breaks, whenever that happens, do not put anything in the vagina. No hot tubbing, no swimming, no baths. If foreign matter is kept out of the vagina, usually there won't be an infection and the mother and the baby will be okay, usually. Let's talk for a minute about the big question, Braxton Hicks versus real labor contractions. How do you know? Okay, so Braxton Hicks contractions don't increase in intensity, and if you time them, they will be irregular. The intervals will be irregular. They'll stop and they'll start, they'll go for a little while, and then they'll start, and they might lessen up if you change positions or eat or drink or exercise. And that's how you can tell if they're Braxton Hicks. All right, so let's get into active labor. So active labor, this is when the contractions start to get really intense. If you have a precipitous labor, which is less than 3 hours from start to finish, you're actually probably going to skip early labor and head straight to active labor. And that's what's happened to me with both of my precipitous labors. I didn't have that burst of energy like I did with my first. My second two, I just went straight to active labor. I was having steady contractions and it was progressing very quickly. But the contractions will become stronger, and effacement and dilation will become faster. Now, the emotional signpost of this labor is seriousness. Another way to describe the mother's emotional state here is out of it. What's going on in her body is so intense that the rest of the world fades away. It's just all in the background. She often will not notice what is going on around her. She'll have a hard time making decisions. She may answer a lot of questions with, I don't know. I remember when I was in active labor, especially with my first baby, my husband kept saying, like, are you having a contraction? I said, I don't know. That was a signpost that I was in active labor, that I was experiencing contractions, but I couldn't even say that I couldn't even tell if I was having contractions. Everything was just so intense and what was going on in my body. But when the contractions are about a minute long and 5 minutes apart, and you can't sit or stand or talk through them, it's usually time to head to your birthing place and make like that PBS series and call the midwife. So now a note here, even if the contractions are a minute long and 5 minutes apart, it might be best to wait until the mom is well into that serious stage or the out of it sort of mood before rushing off anywhere. If mom can smile or laugh, or she's, really walking around pretty active, she's probably not quite far along enough to go to the birthing center or the hospital without experiencing a stalled or slowed labor. Now, when my younger sister was born, I was 5 years old, and my mom kept thinking she was in labor. And there was one, maybe even two times when my parents went and dropped us off at my grandma's house, and they're like, the baby's coming, the baby's coming. And then they come back and there was no baby. My mother was still pregnant. So I talked to my dad, and he said that my mom kept thinking she was in labor, and they go to the midwife, and the midwife said, oh, she's not far enough along. And so then, and the midwife told them to go walk around the mall and see if that would help pick things up. So now, having the experience and knowledge that I do, if I could have that Back to the Future moment with my mother, where I could be there when she was in labor with my younger sister, I would tell her, if you can walk around the mall, it's not time to go to the birthing center. If you're able to go take a walk and you're really with it and everything, it's not time. You're not far enough along. You're not too that far along yet. Another example of this is in, if any of you've watched the TV series The Office, when Pam goes into labor, and Jim is trying to get her to go to the hospital, but she's still walking around. She's walking around and she's active, and and so she wasn't really ready to go to the hospital at that point. Again, Hollywood labors. So why is this important though? Why is the timing so important? Well, if you show up at a hospital or birthing center too early, labor might stall, and you could be in for a really, really long haul, longer than it needs to be. The stress of moving can cause a release of a hormone called catecholamines, and that breaks the flow state of the smoothly going labor. And there's a good reason for this. Evolutionarily speaking, if you are in labor and a threat shows up, like a saber-toothed tiger or something like that, you need to get out of there. So your body will stop labor so that you, as the pregnant mother, can go find a safe spot to finish having your baby. This gets messed up though when you're in a hospital and people are expecting you to just labor, whether you are feeling stressed or not. Your body's not going to respond to that. It's going to shut down if you start to feel stressed. So when labor stalls, you often end up getting Pitocin to get started again. And then that can cause kind of this cascade of interventions where you need more epidural medication to deal with the pain from the Pitocin and the contractions from the Pitocin. And then because the epidural slows down the contractions, and you need more Pitocin, and it makes things a whole lot more complicated than it needs to be. And this is often when women hit that failure to progress label. It's what it's often called in labor and delivery, that you're failing to progress. And I don't think it's so much that that women are failing to progress. It's just that their bodies shut down because they're feeling stressed. So make sure you are very, very well established in labor before you go anywhere. And this is especially important because if you're having a natural birth, that cascade of interventions can often start with, well, it's taking too long. Your labor is taking too long. And even if you're planning to have an epidural, you have to be well into labor so the medication doesn't stall the labor out. You need to be far enough along so that epidural isn't going to cause more problems than it solves. Now, there's a great account of this from Melissa Joan Hart, actually, in More Business of Being Born. She says during her second labor, she had her family at home with her, and they were all laughing and telling jokes. And then when people started telling jokes and she started crying, her mother told her, okay, it's time for you to go to the hospital now. So that's a great example of that emotional signpost of seriousness. You're not happy and chattery anymore. It's time to go. You're very far along, and it's time to go to the hospital. And a couple hours after that, her baby was born naturally at the hospital.